Elijah clutched the wrench in his hand, his eyes fixed on the muddy trail stretching across the ground. He followed the tracks, stepping cautiously towards the cabin. Behind the creaking wooden door, a young woman held 3 children tight, her voice trembling. "They're going to kill us. Please, help us." Dusk draped over the farm like a hot, heavy blanket. Elijah Miller leaned under the shadow of his old rust-pocked car, his sun-darkened hands tightening a stubborn bolt. The screech of metal blended with the drone of cicadas. This rare car was his good luck charm, the only thing he could still talk to after his wife passed. Inside the house, 10-year-old Caleb was still wrestling with a rickety wooden chair. As Elijah wiped sweat from his jawline, his eyes caught a dark red streak stretching across the dusty ground near the fence. The blood was dry and crusted at the edges, but still slick in the middle. The trail wasn't a gush from an accident. It had been dragged, shaped, with deliberate breaks. A purposeful track. He dropped the wrench, stood upright, his shirt soaked to his back. Wind swept in from the fields, carrying the scent of burnt grass mixed with rust. Elijah's gaze darkened like a half-closed window. He followed the blood trail. His boot heels crunched evenly on the dry earth. The path emerged from the burnt grass, leading straight to the cabin. At the porch, Elijah paused to listen. From inside, Caleb's chair creaked a familiar sound, yet out of place in the taut, string-like atmosphere. He reached for his waistband, where his old wrench was tucked. Cautiously, he pushed the wooden door open. The hinges shrieked a long, grating sound, and Elijah's face instantly went ashen at the sight before him. A young woman huddled in the dark corner, her shoulders hunched, face pale and eyes wide open as if there was no room left for a single tear. She clutched 3 small children. The oldest boy, about Caleb's age, had his arm roughly bandaged with a dirty strip of cloth, the edges oozing blood. The little girl with braided hair stared blankly, while the youngest, about 4, burrowed into his mother's side, trembling like a wet kitten. The woman Sarah looked up, her lips bloodless. She mouthed words, softer than a whisper, as if pulled from the bottom of exhausted lungs. "They're going to kill us. Please, help us." Each word hammered down a specific fear, tangible and visible. Elijah still held the wrench tight in his hand, but his gaze left her face, sliding down to the boy's arm. A deep, jagged cut, the mark of a clumsy, sharp object, not an accidental scrape. He slowly lowered the wrench and, in a hoarse voice, he asked, "What's your name, son?" The boy glanced at his mother. "Daniel." "All right, Daniel." The other 2 children were already dozing off from exhaustion. Elijah stood up, went to the water basin, and filled a small bowl. He took a clean rag from a hook by the door, wet it, and returned. Every movement was slow, deliberate, avoiding unnecessary noise. Sarah watched him, her wariness still present, though her pupils stopped twitching. He spoke to the empty space in front of him, as if to the whole room. This might sting a little. Daniel gritted his teeth, 2 veins popping out on his neck. Elijah washed the cut, the blood dissolving in the murky water into streaks of pink. He disinfected it with alcohol, bandaged it with a clean strip of cloth, wrapping it neatly and securing it with a pin. "Done. Keep it dry. Don't move it too much." "Caleb." He didn't turn around, just called out. The boy poked his head out from behind the table leg, his dark brown eyes wet with fear but not fleeing. "Come here." Caleb walked over, breathing quickly. Seeing Daniel wince, he glanced at the youngest boy clinging to his mother's shirt, his tiny hands trembling pitifully. Caleb rummaged in his pocket, pulled out a teddy bear with a torn ear and sandy, worn fur. He held it out to the little boy. "Here, for you." The little boy froze, then hugged it, burying his face in the bear's belly as if seeking a familiar scent. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes softening slightly, a warmth spreading, though not yet peace. The back door creaked open. Agnes, the old neighbor, stood on the porch, as dry as a sun-cured cornstalk, her gray hair coiled at the nape of her neck. She took in the scene with a quick glance, asking no questions. She walked straight to the kitchen cabinet, rummaged for leftover bread, placed it on a plate, and poured water into a tin cup from a ceramic jug. "Eat up." The children rushed forward as if they'd been given permission long ago. The hurried chewing and swallowing were distinctly audible in the otherwise silent room. Agnes pushed another half-piece towards the little girl. "Slow down. There's plenty more." Sarah only broke off the very last corner, chewing slowly, her eyes still scanning the windows, listening as if fear could seep through the cracks. Elijah leaned against the table, his eyes still on Daniel's bandage, then looked outside. The sky had turned red, like a ripe plum someone had crushed. Sarah spoke, her voice small but firm. "We just need to stay the night." Elijah looked directly into her eyes, seeing a pool deep enough for a person to fall into without making a sound. He nodded. "It's dark now. The roads aren't safe." He didn't say stay, but the words settled like a bolted door. Night fell like a damp cloth. The cabin receded into a softly breathing wooden box. Wind whistled through the plank gaps, and firewood crackled in the stove, leaving behind a silence as taut as a drumhead. Elijah sat at the table, his back slightly hunched, his rifle within reach. He wasn't reading, wasn't drinking. He was listening. In the loft, the children's breathing was rapid, then thinned into a rhythm, sometimes catching as they stumbled in bad dreams. In the corner of the room, Sarah turned over once, very lightly, as if afraid to touch her own shadow. Elijah's gaze was fixed on the window. From outside, the wind carried the scent of dry grass and ash, along with a very faint sound that ordinary ears would miss. The weak, sputtering sound of an engine somewhere, like an old person climbing a hill. Then, the harsh, short crunch of tires on gravel. He tilted his head. His heartbeat automatically slowed to make the sounds outside clearer. Then everything went silent, as if a hand had twisted a knob. He stood, unlatched the door, and stepped onto the porch. Darkness swallowed him up to his waist. The moon slid a silver sliver over the tops of the birch trees, and the prairie grasses swayed, rustling as if someone were brushing past. Elijah blinked to adjust to the shadows, scanning the fence line, the edge of the well, the tree where his old dog used to lie. No one. The entire sky held its breath, still, but his gut feeling was lodged there. Something was moving just beyond sight, slowly, patiently, like a predator. He turned back inside, bolted the door, tried it once, then again. The rifle was back on the table, the curtains drawn, the fire in the stove banked low so no light escaped. He sat, hand on the wooden stock, his eyes fixed between 2 points, the window frame and the small staircase leading to the loft. The night stretched long like a string. Every creak had a form, every silence a sharp edge. Before the roosters crowed, the sky had already begun to lighten. Morning light seeped through the door cracks, carrying a hint of damp dew. Elijah stood, splashed cold water on his face, and checked Daniel's bandage. It was dry, not bleeding. The boy was fast asleep. Sarah sat leaning against the wall, her eyes dark-rimmed, nodding when their gazes met. Agnes brewed a pot of water, setting it on the table without a word. Elijah took his keys, glancing at Caleb. "You watch the house. Only open the door for folks you know." Caleb nodded, his lips pressed tight. The old car sputtered to life, coughed a few times, then found its rhythm. The rumbling engine carried the scent of gasoline. The crunch of tires on gravel vibrated under his foot on the accelerator. The road into town was still damp with dew, the ground black and flat. The cool morning air did nothing to soothe the hard knot in Elijah's chest. It felt like a stone shoved into his shirt pocket, heavy wherever he went. In front of the general store, he turned off the engine. A few eyes turned, then turned away. Frank Dixon leaned against the porch post, next to a man in a wide-brimmed hat. Their conversation snapped like a broken string when Elijah stepped onto the stoop. Frank's smile spread but didn't reach his eyes. "Heard Mr. Miller's had some distinguished guests at his place lately, haven't you?" He drawled each word, leisurely. "I saw Silas Blackwood. He's looking for his sister-in-law and her kids. He says she mistook something that didn't belong to her." The early wind ruffled Elijah's shirt to one side. He didn't answer. Walking past them, his hand briefly touched the brim of his hat, a gesture of polite acknowledgement. Inside the store, he gathered salt, gauze, needle and thread, a little flour, and ammunition. The store owner wrapped the items, his eyes briefly meeting Elijah's before sliding away. Whispers buzzed like a swarm of flies behind him. Which way did they go? Like someone's hiding. The words fell onto the wooden floor and got stuck under the heels of his boots. Back on the porch, Frank was still there. "Just so you know, folks like Silas don't much care for being told no." Elijah took the bag, looking him straight between the eyes. "I don't much care for being threatened." The words landed flat. Frank smirked, tilting his head. "We'll see." He lowered his voice. The scent of tobacco mixed with damp leather. "Got any torches at your place? Prairie nights get windy, easy to catch fire." The parting words were both a reminder and a faint whiff of sulfur. Elijah got into the car. The engine rumbled heavily, pulling him out of town. On the slope overlooking his farm, He suddenly saw a silent black dot on the distant hillside, a lone rider, still as if rooted, a figure sitting upright in the saddle, head turned towards the cabin. The distance was too great to make out a face, but the posture was unmistakable. A watcher. Elijah pressed the accelerator. The old car whined, its speed increasing inch by slow inch, as if carrying the weight of the sun on its back. Back home, he parked the car under the shade of the porch. Sarah sat mending a shirt, her needle moving unevenly. The needle trembled slightly, the stitching puckered. Elijah didn't ask. He knelt on one knee on the step, pointing. Fold the edge of the fabric in, sew diagonally, the thread will hold tight. His calloused fingertips briefly touched her hand, warm and quick. Sarah started, then exhaled, her gaze softening by half a beat. Thank you. Daniel's wound is fine. We'll change the bandage again this afternoon. He said it as if reporting the weather. Caleb ran out, hugging his waist. Dad, who are they? Are you going to make them leave? The boy's breath was hot through his shirt, the question echoing into the place where Elijah kept things not meant for children. He ruffled his son's hair, Caleb's hair dry and spiky. They needed a place to sleep. We have enough beds. But what if they come? Caleb looked up. Elijah gazed towards the edge of the woods. Then I'll stand at the door. Agnes brought a pot of stew out to the porch, setting it between them like a silent agreement. Lily carried a bowl for her brother. Daniel stood by the door with his white bandaged arm, and the other child was still asleep from exhaustion and illness. Sarah pulled a long thread, bit it off, and looked up. In her eyes, there was no longer emptiness, only the measured calculation of someone who had gone too far to turn back. I'll leave soon, she said, her voice hoarse from lack of sleep. Elijah nodded. Soon means tomorrow morning. He placed the bag of supplies on the table, gauze, needles, a box of ammunition. His eyes turned back to the fields. The shadow of the lone rider on the hillside had vanished, leaving in quiet emptiness that made the wind sound louder than usual. Elijah understood. From this moment on, he wasn't just keeping a house safe. He was holding a line for Caleb, a line between childhood and the harsh world outside. The danger was standing very close, close enough to hear its breath. The next morning, the fog hadn't fully lifted. Caleb and Daniel were throwing rocks into a puddle outside. Lily was braiding Ethan's hair. Sarah stood on the porch, her hands gripping the hem of her dress. Elijah, I need to talk to you. Inside the cabin, sunlight streamed through the window pane, casting a yellow streak across the tabletop. Elijah pulled up a chair. Tell me what happened. Sarah took a deep breath, her voice low but steady. My husband died 2 years ago. Our land, the most fertile strip by the ditch, he'd taken care of it for 15 years. Silas and Gideon Blackwood came after the funeral. They brought liquor, then a lawyer. 3 months later, our fence was cut. Their cattle were driven through my fields. I rebuilt it, and the next night, someone knocked down the posts. Then my well water started to smell like chemicals. For a whole week, little Lily was constantly sick. Sarah paused, her eyes fixed on the tabletop. They brought papers saying the land was mortgaged, a red seal, a forged signature of my husband. I knew because his G always dropped below the line, and theirs didn't. I didn't sign. The night I ran, 2 of their men came. One threw a lantern at the wall, the other dragged Daniel out of bed. I grabbed the dull axe from under the kitchen counter, and they backed off. I led the children behind the horse barn, through a dry ditch to the main road. Daniel's cut was from the barbed wire they strung. Elijah was silent. His jaw tightened, a thin vein standing out on his neck. He poured water, pushing it towards her. Did your husband leave anything behind? Sarah nodded. Yes, he kept the original deed in a leather pouch, along with a letter detailing how Silas had once been arrested for burning a warehouse in the next county, but got away. I hid that pouch in the lining of my jacket pocket, wrapped in oilcloth to keep out the damp. And there's a notebook listing the dates they cut the fence, the names of the people who showed up. I always carry it. Sarah opened the hem of her dress, tearing a small, restitched seam. She pulled out a thin leather pouch and placed it on the table. Elijah put on his glasses, turning each page. The county seal was faded but authentic. The land measurements matched the description in the letter. There were even small bits of paper like a broken latch, a rusty piece of wire, each with a date noted. Elijah folded them, saying succinctly, "We're going to see the sheriff." Sarah immediately shook her head. "They own half this county. The sheriff's Silas's hunting buddy. If we show them these papers, we'll just be telling them what we have." Elijah looked directly into her eyes. "Maybe. But some things you have to stand up for. Not just for your land. He spoke slowly, as if nailing his own conviction. I don't want Caleb to believe that silence is the only way. She suppressed a tired smile. So we don't go empty-handed. Elijah nodded. Number, we go with witnesses, with copies, with a clear path. And we go in broad daylight. In the days that followed, everything moved in small steps. Elijah checked the engine, replaced belts, adjusted engine mounts, flushed the gas tank. He tried starting it, listening for any strange noises. The engine still heats up fast, he said, his hand on the hood. Agnes trimmed her dress for practicality, sewing a secret pocket inside Sarah's coat for the papers. She packed hard bread, bacon, salt. Enough for 2 days, she said. Lily learned how to tie Daniel's bandage. This time, he didn't wince. Ethan hugged his teddy bear like a shield. That afternoon, Elijah sat with Caleb on the steps. Do you see why we're helping them? Caleb nodded, rubbing his foot in the sand. Because they're weaker. If we're strong, and we step up, then it's fairer. Elijah chuckled softly. Also, because someday you'll face things that aren't right. When that happens, if you choose to stand with those who have no voice, you'll sleep better. Caleb looked up, his eyes clear. I won't open the door for strangers, but if it's them, I will. The night before they left, Elijah quickly wrote out 3 copies. One to keep in the cabin, one for Agnes, and one to ask the store owner in town to hold temporarily listing the documents and confirming he'd received them from Sarah. Agnes read it, nodding. Solid enough. Sarah checked the leather pouch 3 times, restitching the edge of her dress. She handed Elijah a piece of a letter. My husband wrote the name of the man who witnessed the deed, an old church clerk. If he's still alive, that's the key. Elijah tucked it into his inner coat pocket, close to his heart. Early on the morning of their departure, a thin fog still lay. Elijah instructed, Caleb, sit in the back, next to Lily. Daniel, hold onto the leather pouch. Sarah, watch Ethan. If anyone stops us, I'll do the talking. The rest of you stay quiet. Sarah nodded, her face strangely calm. Agnes hung a small wooden crucifix on the car's rearview mirror. For good luck. Elijah didn't believe in charms, but he didn't take it down. The engine started. The rumble was still hoarse but steady. The car rolled off the porch. The children didn't speak, just looked back at the house. Sarah let out a short sigh. Elijah looked at the straight road into town, then glanced at the narrow path that branched off towards the church where the old clerk used to be. He chose the path dense with trees, less traveled. When the old car lurched over the first pothole, they had already become a single unit. Each person carrying a share of the responsibility, no one a guest in another's house anymore. Elijah gripped the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the curves. He knew this fight was uneven, but from inside the car, the 4 children sat still. Sarah sat upright, and Agnes grew smaller on the porch. Their unity made the old engine's hum sound less weary. On the morning of the second day, Elijah turned the key. The engine roared louder than usual, a deliberate, grinding sound. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, clutching the document pouch. Caleb was in the back, his eyes glued to the rearview mirror. Agnes's horse-drawn wagon carried the children a ways behind, its wheels turning slowly to stay out of sight of the town. The road opened into town. As they turned onto Main Street, glances immediately turned their way. There were soft whistles, a few abrupt questions. Who's that? Is that one of the Millers? Elijah's old rusty car emitted a steady growl, like a stake driven into the road. They stopped in front of Sheriff Hayes's office. Elijah carried the pouch of papers. Sarah walked close beside him. Hayes opened the door, his eyes darting down the hallway before closing it. Inside the room, he listened as Sarah recounted. The fence destroyed, the well poisoned, the forged documents, the night they fled. Elijah placed the original deed, the letter, and the notebook with dates in front of him. Hayes carefully examined the seal, turned the edge of the paper, asking brief questions at a few points. His temple twitched slightly. I'll start an investigation, he said slowly. But it won't be easy. The Blackwoods have money, connections. They won't just let this go. Sarah remained silent, just nodding. Elijah replied curtly, I understand. When they stepped out, the atmosphere had shifted. Door cracks narrowed a little further. 2 men leaning against the porch stopped talking, looked directly, then turned their faces away. Caleb crouched low in the back, his hand still on the seat back, his eyes on the mirror. Agnes drove the wagon around to the end of the street, parking at the blacksmith shop to keep the children out of the staring crowd. Elijah led Sarah through the general store to buy supplies. The store owner, who used to smile and extend credit, placed his hand on the ledger. "Your family's account hasn't been settled." Elijah looked at the blank page. "I'm paying cash." The owner shook his head. "It's not convenient to sell today." The refusal was as abrupt as a slamming bolt. A man standing nearby coughed, spitting into the dust near Elijah's shoe. "Don't bring trouble to town," he said, just loud enough to be heard. Sarah stood upright, her hand still gripping the hem of her dress. Elijah turned away, not arguing. They left the porch, crossing the street. Whispers followed them. "That Miss Brooks. They say she stole from the Blackwoods. Miller's hiding her." The fragmented words were like salt sprinkled into the air. Caleb tilted his head, his face hardening. Elijah said quietly, without turning his head, "Eyes forward." Sheriff Hayes stopped them outside the blacksmith shop. His face was creased, his voice low. "Heard you've got Sarah Brooks under your roof. The Blackwoods are spreading rumors you lured her away and stole documents. They won't stop talking." He glanced at the rifle on Elijah's shoulder. "Don't let it leave its scabbard unless you absolutely have to. Be careful, Miller. They're dangerous folks." Elijah looked him straight in the eye. "I know what I'm doing." Hayes sighed, stepping aside to let them pass. Down the street, a few eyes didn't shy away. The widowed innkeeper gave a small nod as they passed. The blacksmith pointed towards his backyard, offering a small cloth bundle. "Leather straps for your radiator. No charge." He spoke quietly, his eyes darting side to side. The flicker of support was brief but clear. Sarah whispered, "Thank you." Elijah took the items, quickly tucking them into the car's compartment. The news spread like wildfire in the wind. At the tavern at the end of the street, there was loud laughter. The knight's car. Someone slapped the counter, glasses clinking. Another spoke as if reading a proclamation. "Rules here are simple, don't mess with the Blackwoods." Elijah didn't stop. He loaded the things he'd bought from other stores onto the car. Salt, flour, a few rounds of ammunition bought discreetly from an old hunter's stash. His eyes didn't meet the crowd. Sarah walked beside him, the document pouch tucked under her arm. "You can drop me off at the church," she said softly. "The children and I can wait there." Elijah shook his head. "The whole family goes together. We leave before dark." Caleb looked at his father in the mirror, nodding very slightly as if receiving an order. By noon, the sun beat down directly. The car rolled towards the end of the street. Before they turned onto the main road, Sheriff Hayes stood on the street corner, hands on his hips. He didn't call them back, just cast his eyes across the entire road as if confirming he had seen them. Elijah nodded very slightly. Agnes's wagon rejoined them from behind. Lily hugged Ethan. Daniel sat upright, his face resolute like an adult. The footsteps watching them began to thin out as they left the range of curious eyes and ears. Over the crest of the hill, in the rearview mirror, a group of wide-brimmed hats were faintly visible on the tavern porch, their mouths moving. Elijah lowered the mirror, speaking just loud enough for Sarah to hear. "They want to turn us into a story to tell." Sarah replied, "Then we'll hold on to the true part of the story." Elijah's old car left town with its hoarse engine rumble their only voice amidst a forest of rumors. On the way back, no one spoke further. Elijah understood that from now on, he and Sarah were not only up against the Blackwoods, but also against all the backs that had turned away. A few quiet nights passed, but without peace of mind. Elijah checked the door bolts every evening, walked around the fence line, his eyes accustomed to spotting disturbed grass. Sarah handled meals, rebandaged Daniel's arm. Caleb took turns standing guard with his father. Their normal life was just a thin veil over the feeling of being watched. That night, the wind was dry, the sky moonless. Elijah was at the east fence, where the barbed wire sagged. He held pliers. Caleb and Daniel carried nails and a hammer. "Keep the light low," Elijah told them. Caleb replied softly, "Yes, sir." Just as the clang of metal ceased, Agnes's scream ripped through the night. "Elijah!" The pliers fell to the ground. Elijah spun around, racing off. "Caleb, run ahead!" he shouted. The boy shot forward, Daniel close behind. From a distance, the cabin's front door was flung open, lantern light spilling onto the porch. Inside was chaos. Gideon Blackwood, his face bloated, eyes glazed, stood in the middle of the room, two burly men flanking him. One seized Sarah's arm, dragging her from the kitchen. The other had already stepped onto the stairs, heading straight for the loft where Lily and Ethan were hiding. Caleb had just managed to push the two children deeper into the storage space, his body blocking the last step. Agnes stood straight in the middle of the floor, her old hands gripping the shotgun Elijah kept within reach by the fireplace. She lowered the barrel, her voice hoarse but firm. "Let her go. Get out of here," Gideon sneered. "Old woman, you've got 10 seconds before I rip that out of your hands and teach you some manners." The door slammed against the wall. Elijah burst in like a whistling gale. He grabbed Gideon by the collar, yanked him backward, and slammed him hard against the wooden wall. Gideon's hat flew off. His head hit the planks, eliciting a choked groan. The man dragging Sarah spun around, throwing a punch. Elijah parried, snatched his wrist, twisting it deeply. A dry crack. The man howled, releasing Sarah, falling to his knees, clutching his arm. The man on the stairs rushed down, swinging a club. Caleb dodged instantly. Agnes pulled the trigger. The blast echoed through the room, lead shot tearing splinters from the staircase, wood flying. The man froze, terrified, holding his breath, retreating slowly, cursing crudely. Elijah kicked the club away, forcing him back against the door. Gideon struggled to his feet, wiping blood from his lip, his grotesque smile returning. "You think this is over, Miller?" He spat each word. "This ain't done. You mess with our business, you'll pay." He glanced at Sarah, his eyes burning with malice. "You'll be back, Sarah. What belongs to the Blackwoods always comes back to the Blackwoods." He jerked his chin as a signal. The three men scattered towards the door, yanked it open, and retreated. Gideon paused on the porch, calling back, "Keep your lights low. Windy night." The door slammed shut. The smell of gunpowder, sweat, and fear mingled. Sarah hugged her children tight as Caleb led Lily and Ethan down. Daniel stood leaning against the wall, his face pale but his chin set. Agnes still held the gun, barrel pointed down, her breathing rapid but steady. Sarah turned to Elijah, her shoulders shaking, her voice choked. "You can't keep doing this. You'll get yourself killed." Elijah wiped sweat from his forehead, looking directly into her eyes, his voice low but clear. "I think we'll cross that bridge when we come to it." His gaze didn't waver. There was the only real answer for now. Protect the home. Protect the people. He made a quick circuit, rebolting the doors, pulling the table to barricade the porch, dimming the lights, tucking more ammunition into his pocket. "Caleb, take your brother and sister to the room. Lock the loft." "Yes, sir." "Daniel, sit down. Let me see your hand." Elijah rechecked the bandage, tightening the knot. Agnes placed the gun on the table, her eyes still on the door. "I'll sleep right here. You rest, I'll stand guard," Elijah said. "Number I can manage," she replied curtly. Sarah placed the document pouch on the table, as if anchoring a boat to the only dock left to trust. "If they come back," she left the sentence hanging. Elijah picked up his rifle, resting the barrel against his elbow. "Then I'll still be at the door." Night drew tight around the cabin. Wind lashed the roof, and the wooden floor groaned whenever anyone shifted. The children lay still, asking no questions. In the silence, Gideon's threat seemed to still hang in the doorframe. The cabin changed after just one night. Elijah installed more bolts, reinforced the windows with wooden bars, and moved the rifle to an easily accessible spot. Caleb took turns with Daniel, walking a circuit around the porch every night. Lily often woke up in the middle of the night. Caleb would sit by the door, give her the teddy bear, and whisper, "I'm right here." Ethan was able to sleep again, his hand never leaving his sister's shirt hem. Sarah spoke less, but her eyes were steadier. On Tuesday morning, Elijah took Sarah and the children to Sheriff Hayes' office. Elijah still had a bruise on his cheek. Sarah's hands were red and scraped. Hayes glanced at them, paused for a long moment, then invited them in. Sarah placed the document pouch on the table, and Elijah briefly recounted the attack. Hayes examined each paper: the original deed, the notebook recording the fence damage, the letter. He took out his glasses, inspecting the seal. "The witness's signature has a broken B. At the end, someone imitated it but missed that broken stroke." Hayes put his glasses down, exhaling. "I'll investigate. There's no other way." From that day on, Sheriff Hayes agreed to accompany them. He called in several people who had had land disputes with the Blackwoods. At first, everyone shook their heads. "Don't know, don't remember." Elijah didn't argue, simply saying, "I need one true statement." At Mr. Peterson's farm, the widowed wife pulled Elijah to the back porch, handing him a scrap of paper. "They made my husband sign this when he was drunk. The seal is exactly like the one on Brooks's paper. Hayes opened his notebook, recording the date, name, and comparing the seals. Elijah drove his car to every farm. The old engine growled hoarsely, but ran steadily. At the blacksmith shop, a worker slipped a scrap of paper into Elijah's hand. I once saw Gideon bring a seal stamp to the tavern. At the dry dock, the one-eyed fisherman said, they hired someone to tear out old debt ledger pages and write new numbers. Hayes turned to the county ledger. Cross-referencing erasures showed under the light. Sarah sat beside him, her hands on her lap, silently listening as each detail matched the night she fled. One afternoon, Agnes returned, leading a scrawny old man in a worn coat, his wrists trembling slightly. This is Arthur Finch, she introduced. He used to be a clerk for the Blackwoods legal office. He nodded with difficulty. They kicked me out when my hands got too shaky to forge signatures anymore. He pulled a black-covered frayed notebook from his inner pocket. I kept this to remind myself of what I did. Hayes opened the notebook. A list of transactions, codes for cash transfers, with marginal notes like borrowed county seal for 2 nights, changed ledger page for plot 268 Brooks. Elijah said nothing, only stared at the 268 entry. Mr. Finch recounted, his words concise and direct. Silas had enticed a young, inexperienced clerk to borrow the county seal stamp for 2 nights, in exchange for money and a clerical position. They used the same type of paper, burned the edges to age it, and pressed thick red wax to cover up ink impressions. Here, he pushed forward a chipped piece of the seal stamp, a very small notch, but enough for Hayes to nod. It matches the mark on the forged deed. The evidence was undeniable. The counter rumors didn't stop either. One afternoon, Elijah arrived at his gate to find an unmarked envelope. Inside was a note, "Don't preach," along with a pinch of dirt mixed with sawdust, a familiar sign from the Blackwoods. The next morning, his tire was flat. The windshield had a spiderweb crack. When he opened the engine, the fuel line was clogged with sediment. Elijah pressed his lips together, not swearing. He removed the hose, flushed it, replaced the belt. Caleb stood by, handing him tools. Sarah wiped the windshield, temporarily patching the crack with pine resin. "They want to waste your time," she said. "I've got time," Elijah replied, his hand still tightening a nut. The pressure went straight to the children. At the market, boys pulled Caleb to the side. Thief's bodyguard. They pelted him with pebbles. Caleb didn't throw back, only shielded Lily and Ethan. When he got into the car, his lip was bleeding. Elijah asked, "Does it hurt much?" Caleb shook his head, his eyes dark. "I'm okay, but why do they hate me when I didn't do anything wrong?" Elijah was silent for a moment, then said, "Because someone wants them to believe that. If we do what's right, they'll understand eventually. Slowly, but they'll understand." Caleb nodded, swallowing an invisible lump. Sheriff Hayes did his part. He went to the old church, looking for the notary ledger. A page was torn out. He flipped the cover. A new stitch showed. "This is where they swapped the page," he pointed out. He returned to his office, writing a summons for the young, inexperienced clerk. The man arrived, sweat on his forehead, spoke evasively for a while, then burst into tears. "I just thought it was to speed up the ledger stamping." Hayes recorded the statement, closing the binder carefully, as if putting away a burning coal. Silas and Gideon didn't stay quiet. The postman relayed a message. "Someone's been asking about your travel schedule." That night, someone drove a stake into the ground in front of the cabin gate, with a piece of red cloth tied to it. Agnes yanked it out, throwing it into the fire. "Burn it to break its hex," she said. Elijah didn't believe in hexes, but he understood the meaning. They wanted him to know they were close. The investigation advanced one step further, then hit a wall. To press charges, they needed a transfer record with Silas's signature, or money tracing back to him. Sarah looked at Hayes. "Without that, it's still just our word against theirs." Hayes nodded, not sugarcoating it. "That's right." He turned to Mr. Finch. "Are there any documents you haven't turned over?" The old man shook his head. "I only managed to hide this notebook." Elijah wasn't impatient. He took matters into his own hands. Carrying the list of victims, he knocked on every door. A young ranch hand finally opened his door a crack, whispering, "I once drove Gideon to the South Grain warehouse in the middle of the night. They were moving a safe." He pressed a rusty key into Elijah's hand. "Warehouse number 3. I'm tired of being their dog." Hayes recorded the coordinates, instructing, "Don't let anyone see you talking to us." That evening, Elijah sat on the steps, Caleb leaning against his shoulder. Sarah brought out 2 cups of water. No one spoke of fear anymore. Everyone understood it was present, like a shadow. Elijah looked at the reinforced door, at the children huddled together, no longer straying. He knew he wasn't alone anymore. Agnes, Sheriff Hayes, Mr. Finch, a blacksmith, a young ranch hand, those who still held a shred of conscience were forming a thin but connected thread. At dawn, Sheriff Hayes sent a small note. Tonight, warehouse number 3. As Elijah tucked the paper into his pocket, a dry bang echoed from the edge of the woods, not a firecracker, but a warning. On the car's windshield, the recently patched spiderweb crack suddenly spread further. Elijah stood, speaking softly enough for Sarah and Caleb to hear. "We're about to hit the core." He grabbed his jacket, his other hand tightening around the rusty key, the first piece of evidence to unlock the inner workings of their power. Sheriff Hayes gathered statements like picking up paving stones. In the morning, he went with Elijah and Sarah to each house. An old man with trembling hands pointed to a broken fence. That night, Gideon's men cut through here. A widow placed an ink, smudged paper on the table. "I was forced to sign when I was drunk," a ranch hand whispered. "I drove their safe down to the south warehouse." Each story matched a point in the black notebook Mr. Finch had provided, and the picture gradually emerged, every stroke dirty. Mr. Finch, pale but alert, sat by the sheriff's office window, reading each file name, pointing out each forged signature. "This G here is Gideon's hand. He drags the tail too long. The county seal is chipped at the corner here." Hayes marked it with a red pencil, sealing it in a folder. He spoke softly, as if afraid the words might escape. "Enough to present to superiors. But to dig out the roots, we need the original forged documents and where they're kept." Sarah opened a map. The grain fields to the south. Warehouse number 3. That afternoon, Sheriff Hayes sent a telegram to the big city. "Need an honest judge, as soon as possible." The reply came that evening. Judge Reynolds would be on the morning train, accompanied by a federal agent named Stone. Hayes looked at Elijah. "We need to keep the pressure on until they arrive." Elijah nodded. "I'll open the warehouse." Hayes frowned. "Dangerous." Elijah replied, "We can't just sit here counting the hours." The plan was quick. Elijah used his old rickety car, deliberately making the engine loud, creating noise on the western trail to draw the watchman away. Caleb insisted on coming along. "No," Elijah dismissed him. Caleb didn't back down. "I won't leave you alone, Dad." Elijah looked straight at him, seeing his own familiar stubbornness. "All right, but you follow orders. Don't leave the car until I call you." Hayes positioned 2 supporters to hide near the reeds, holding covered flashlights. Sarah stayed in the cabin with Lily and Ethan, her hand never leaving the document pouch. Agnes reassured, "I'll be right by the door." Night fell thin. The car lurched up the dirt slope, the engine drumming. At the edge of the reeds, a figure started, retreating from its observation post. Elijah eased off the gas as he reached the wooden wall of the warehouse. Caleb sat low, his eyes fixed on his father's hands. The ranch hand's rusty key slid into the lock. A hard twist, and the lock yielded. Inside, the smell of damp grain mixed with machine oil. Caleb held the light low, sweeping it across the wooden crates. Elijah lifted the lid of one crate, finding papers tied with cloth string. A red wax seal chipped at the corner, the exact mark. He tucked each bundle into a canvas bag, leaving a few items behind so as not to make it look empty. A small trunk lay deeper inside, secured with a simple lock. Elijah broke it open with a crowbar, revealing a handwritten ledger, several cloth bags heavy with silver coins, and a copper stamp. "Is that enough?" Caleb asked, his voice so faint it was barely a breath. "One more roll," Elijah replied. Footsteps crunched on the gravel outside the door. A hoarse voice. "Who's in there?" Caleb froze. Elijah lowered his voice. "Light." The boy extinguished it. The warehouse door swung open a crack, a lantern beam piercing the darkness. Elijah grabbed Caleb's hand, retreating behind a crate. The watchman took 2 steps inside, stopping when he heard an engine revving at the edge of the woods. Hayes had someone creating a diversion at just the right moment. The man cursed, then turned to leave. Elijah and Caleb slipped out, closing the warehouse, locking it back as it was. The 2 ran low against the wall, climbing into the car. "Hold on tight," Elijah said, stomping on the gas. The tires crunched loudly on the gravel. Just then, from another angle, another man ran to cut them off, raising his gun. Elijah swerved, the car fishtailed, its tail kicking up dust. The bullet embedded itself in the wooden crate in the back. making a dry thud. Caleb ducked down, hugging the bag of papers. "Heads down," Elijah yelled. A lone rider from the edge of the reeds cut down the trail, blocking their way. Elijah didn't have enough room to stop. He stomped the clutch, downshifted. The engine roared. The rear wheels spun fiercely. The old car cleared the edge of the ditch, squeezing past the horse's tail by a hair's breadth. The rider cursed, raising his gun. Elijah yanked the handbrake. The car skidded. Turning around, he aimed his rifle through the window, firing a warning shot that plowed into the ground just in front of the horse's hooves. The animal reared. The rider swayed, his gun flying. "Don't!" Caleb cried out softly, his eyes wide but tearless. Elijah pulled him down. "It's all right." Behind them, a whistling call arose. A figure with a lantern gave chase. Elijah floored the accelerator. The engine screamed, raw but resilient, pulling them out of the clearing. Over the last crest, he turned off the lights, letting the car coast by inertia into the birch grove, stopping after about 30 breaths. No one spoke. Only the smell of hot metal and sweat. They returned to the cabin while it was still dark. Sarah opened the door as soon as she heard the secret knock. Agnes lit a low lamp. Elijah placed the bag on the table. Inside, the ledger, the copper seal, 3 bundles of papers with the chipped wax seal, and a bag of silver marked off-book funds. Sheriff Hayes entered last, his eyes gleaming, enough to put them in cuffs. He folded the documents into a sealed envelope, signing the seal. "Tomorrow morning, I'll meet Reynolds and Stone." News traveled fast, like a headwind. The next afternoon, at the tavern, Silas smashed a glass on the table. "You let them touch my warehouse?" His face was bruised purple. Gideon stood beside him, old dried blood still crusting the corner of his mouth, speaking through gritted teeth. "Gather the men tonight. End this." Silas was no longer smiling. "No more warnings. Burn them out so they know fear. Grab the woman. Get the papers back." He flung a piece of red cloth onto a map. "North Road, 2 prongs." Elijah caught a piece of news from the postman. "They're gathering." Sheriff Hayes tightened the brim of his hat. "Reynolds arrives this afternoon. We hold out until then." He assigned positions. 2 at the edge of the woods, 1 hidden by the well, signaling with covered lanterns. Elijah instructed Caleb, "You stay inside. Listen to your mother." Caleb bit his lip. "I understand." That evening, the wind shifted east. The papers lay on the table, sealed, waiting to be handed to the judge. Sarah counted them one more time, her eyes steady. Mr. Finch sat by the stove, his hands wrapped around a hot mug as if cradling an old debt. Agnes placed the gun on the doorstep, her back straight. Elijah checked his ammunition, pulled the door bolt one last time. From the fields outside, torches flickered like a string of animal eyes. The rough sound of hooves and wagon wheels drew closer, making no attempt to hide. On the hill, someone blew a short whistle, a signal to converge. Elijah spoke, loud enough for the room to hear. "They're here before the court." He picked up the ledger, tucked it inside his jacket, and handed the seal to Sheriff Hayes. "Hold on to this." Hayes nodded. In the moment the cabin held its breath, Caleb took Lily's hand. The windows rattled slightly from the wind and from the approaching footsteps. The fight, now, was no longer just anyone's. Sheriff Hayes stood by the fence, checking hand signals. Elijah pulled back the tarp covering the earth mound, placing the ammunition box back. Agnes had taken Sarah, Caleb, Lily, and Ethan to a hiding spot by the rocky stream. 2 trusted townsfolk stood guard. On the kitchen table, the sealed envelope waited to be handed to Judge Reynolds and Federal Agent Stone as soon as the road was clear. From a distance, the sounds of hooves and engines merged into a thick band of noise. Dust rose, dotted with torchlight. Silas Blackwood rode at the front, his dark coat, his eyes narrowed. To his right, Gideon gritted his teeth, the old bruise still raw at the corner of his mouth. Behind them were a dozen men, some on horseback, some on crude, iron-framed motorbikes, their headlights flashing yellow. Sheriff Hayes raised his hand. "Stop at the edge of Miller's land. This is private property. A search warrant is pending." Silas laughed, not slowing down. "I've got my own orders." He jerked his chin. The formation spread out. Elijah pulled a rope. An iron chain snapped out of a ditch, stretching across the path. The first motorbike sped forward, its front wheel hitting the chain, the rider thrown off, tumbling across the grass. Shouts erupted. Gunshots rang out. Elijah aimed low, firing at the axle of a horse-drawn wagon. The animal halted, The wagon lurched. 2 men tumbled out. Hayes and 2 farmers hidden behind the log pile fired suppressive shots, each one clear and well-placed, not wasted. The Blackwoods returned fire in a torrent. Wood splinters flew from the fence. The smell of smoke, oil, and wet earth mingled. Gideon led 3 men, slipping through the ditch bank, heading straight for the cabin. Elijah changed position, sliding from the earth mound onto the porch. Gideon threw a knife, its blade embedding itself in the wooden post. Elijah slammed his rifle butt into Gideon's lower ribs. Gideon doubled over, then lunged to tackle. Both crashed into the door, the hinges groaning. Gideon punched. Elijah blocked, seizing the moment to grip his wrist, twisting it back. Gideon roared, headbutting sideways. Elijah stepped back half a pace, driving his knee into Gideon's thigh. The 2 men with Gideon rushed in. One staggered as Agnes fired a shotgun blast past his feet from the side window, lurching. The other poked his gun through a crack, but Hayes knocked it aside with a shot, the barrel flying from his hand. In the yard, Silas spurred his horse around to the left, trying to flank them. Elijah saw him, shouting, "Left side!" The blacksmith pulled a rope, releasing a pile of sharpened stakes that blocked the path. The horse swerved, Silas forced to cut into the soft earth rose. Elijah turned back, blocking Gideon's punch with his rifle stock, pinning him against the wall. "It's over," Elijah said hoarsely. Gideon spot blood, his smile twisted. "You still don't get it." He twisted his body, his left hand grabbing a second knife hidden in his boot. Elijah quickly seized his wrist. Twisting it, the knife fell. He delivered a short punch to the chin. Gideon collapsed, tied with rope right there on the porch. Engine roars screamed close to the fence. 2 iron-framed vehicles charged straight, trying to cross the chain. Hayes yelled, "Down!" A volley of shots targeted their wheels. One flipped, the other had to brake hard. The driver threw his gun, crawling behind a mound of grass. Silas howled, "Advance! Burn it!" A man uncorked an oil bottle. Elijah raised his rifle, shooting him in the wrist. The bottle fell, oil splashing onto the already pre-soaked wet ground. The flame flickered once and died. Just then, white lights flared on the distant hill. A line of escort cars snaked down, their acetylene headlights sweeping the ground. A long horn blast. A strange, stern voice. "Federal marshals. Drop your weapons." Judge Reynolds and Agent Stone stood on the running board of the lead car, long coats, badges gleaming under the lights. The henchmen looked at each other. Some threw down their guns and scattered, half knelt, hands clasped behind their heads. Silas understood the battle was lost. He jumped onto an intact iron-framed vehicle, gunning the engine, and sped towards the rocky outcrop. "Miller!" Hayes shouted. Elijah leapt into his own car, the engine growling, but catching. "Get in!" Hayes jumped into the passenger seat, holding his hat. The old car strained, chasing the trail of dust Silas left behind. The trail was narrow. Silas weaved past a birch tree, nearly scraping the rock edge. Elijah held the steering wheel steady, not wasting a shot. Hayes leaned forward. "Closer!" Elijah downshifted, pressed the gas. The engine roared. The car surged forward another half-length. "His back wheels shoot low," Elijah said. Hayes aimed, squeezed the trigger. The bullet plowed through the spokes. Silas's vehicle swerved violently, but kept going. Silas turned and fired back. Elijah's windshield spiderwebbed, glass fragments hitting his cheek. He didn't blink. The final curve opened onto a slick rocky patch. Silas risked cutting the corner, his wheels skidding. Elijah didn't miss a beat, sweeping his car to cut him off. Hayes fired another shot at the axle. A dry crack. Silas's vehicle spun, its tail whipping into a thorny bush, engine dead. He fumbled with the latch, jumped from the seat, tumbled, then sprang up and ran. Elijah slammed the brakes, jumping out. "Stop!" Hayes yelled. Silas spun around, raising his gun. 2 shots fired almost simultaneously. Hayes hit Silas in the shoulder. Silas's shot flew past Elijah's ear, embedding itself in a tree trunk. Silas collapsed, his hand dropping. Hayes approached, cuffed him, reading aloud. "Silas Blackwood, you are under arrest for extortion, forgery, armed robbery, attempted arson, and resisting law enforcement." Agent Stone appeared from the car behind, taking the evidence: Silas's gun, a bag of ammunition, a small notebook from his coat. "Take him back," he said curtly. They returned to the farm. Smoke still hung in the air. Gideon lay tied on the porch, his eyes glazed over. The henchmen were herded into a group, hands behind their heads. The blacksmith sat slumped, panting, still clutching the rope he'd used to drop the stakes. Agnes stood straight at the door, her old hands finally relaxed. Sarah and the children returned from their hiding spot. Caleb ran over, looking at the web of cracks on the car's windshield, then at his father. Elijah placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "It's all right." Agent Stone oversaw the collection. The copper seal, the ledger, the bundles of papers with the chipped wax seal, everything was placed into a sealed trunk right there in the yard. Judge Reynolds signed the label, handing it to Hayes for temporary safekeeping. He looked around at the wreckage. Broken fences, deep tire tracks, wood splinters scattered across the porch. "Justice has a cost," he said softly, not for anyone to hear, but as if recording it for himself. The sun finally rose above the trees, its light revealing the battleground. No one cheered. They just stood, checking on each other, counting remaining ammunition, pulling up fallen wooden panels. Elijah re-erected the post in front of the porch, tightening the rope, then sat on the steps, letting out a short sigh. Sarah placed her hand on the edge of the table, looking at the intact sealed envelope, her eyes welling up but not shedding tears. Caleb stooped to pick up spent shell casings, putting them into his pocket, as if gathering fragments of the old night. On the ground, winding tire tracks led to the rocky outcrop, where Silas had collapsed when the sky was still a vibrant blue. The morning wind blew through, carrying the scent of spent smoke and a faint metallic tang from dried blood. The farm stood. Its people stood too. And for the first time, the silence that returned was the silence of peace, not of threat. When court opened that morning, the courtroom was packed. Wooden chairs creaked softly as people shifted, and outside, horse bridles jingled, as if reminding everyone that all eyes were on this place. Judge Reynolds sat upright, gavel striking once. Agent Stone and Sheriff Hayes arranged files on the table, seals still intact. Silas Blackwood, his shirt adjusted, his neck stiff as wood. Gideon sat beside him, shoulder bandaged, eyes bloodshot. Elijah was in the witness row, his hands on his knees. Sarah held her head high, meeting every gaze. "Call Sarah Brooks." Sarah stepped forward, placing her hand on the Bible, her voice steady. "I am Sarah Brooks." Agent Stone asked few questions, letting her tell her story. She recounted the forged documents, the poisoned well, the cut fences, the night she fled. When she mentioned Daniel, her voice deepened, then returned to normal. The Blackwood's lawyer interrupted. "Do you have a personal vendetta?" Sarah replied directly, "I have my land and my children. I hold no grudge against anyone. I just don't want to lose anything more." The courtroom seemed to settle down a notch. Sheriff Hayes presented the chain of evidence. He placed the chipped copper seal on a wooden tray, handing his glasses to the judge. "The chip matches the mark on the transfer deeds exactly." Then he opened the ledger, pointing to the off-book expenditures, dates, and recipients. Agent Stone confirmed the chain of custody, the names of witnesses, and warehouse number 3 where the evidence was collected. The lock was opened with a key taken from their transporter. Agent Stone said curtly, "Call Arthur Finch." The old clerk trembled as he approached, holding the black notebook. He told his story without rambling. Who borrowed the seal, when, how ledger pages were swapped. The Blackwood's lawyer sprang up. "They fired you. You resent them." Mr. Finch looked him straight in the eye. "I resent my past self. Today, I'm making amends." He raised the notebook. "I wrote this because I was afraid of forgetting my part in something wrong." Other victims stood up one after another. The widow presented the ink, smudged paper. The ranch hand recounted the late-night trip. The blacksmith described the seal stamp appearing at the tavern. Each voice had its own tone, but together they formed a seamless map. Elijah was called. He described the break-in at warehouse number 3, the chase, how he shot the wheels instead of aiming at the men. The Blackwood's lawyer narrowed his eyes. "Do you want to be a hero?" Elijah replied, "I want to go home to my son." Silas sneered, muttering something. Judge Reynolds banged his gavel. Silence from the defendant's row. Then it was Silas and Gideon's turn. Silas scoffed. "Fabrication. They made up stories to take my money." Gideon's smile was twisted. "I never laid a hand on their place." Agent Stone placed a photo of the chipped wax seal and the stamp right in front of Gideon. Hayes read a passage from the ledger. "Expenditure for hush money," to the clerk. Judge Reynolds looked directly at the two brothers. "Do you have anything to explain, other than denial?" Silas turned to the crowd, casting threatening glances. No one spoke. Afternoon light slanted through the window. Judge Reynolds took out a handkerchief and wiped his glasses, rereading the key points, each piece of evidence, each testimony. He put his glasses down, his voice firm. The court concludes, Silas Blackwood and Gideon Blackwood are found guilty of fraud, forgery, extortion, organized assault, and resisting law enforcement. Long-term prison sentences in the county jail, with federal transfer for cross-referencing records in neighboring counties. Assets used for criminal activity will be confiscated. All involved parties will be summoned. The gavel struck 3 times. Gideon let out a low growl, and marshals cuffed him. Silas was no longer smiling. News traveled faster than the wind. That same afternoon, the general store owner stepped out onto the porch as Elijah passed. He held the old ledger, pushing it into Elijah's hand. This part. I made a mistake. He added a bag of sugar and salt. No charge. The blacksmith greeted him first, speaking just loud enough to be heard. Miller. A few other nods blossomed, free of bitterness. No one apologized with words. They rearranged their chairs, reopened their doors their way. At the courthouse, Judge Reynolds signed the land deeds back to the victims. Sarah received her new certificate, the county seal stamped right on the cover. She took a deep breath, touching her name with her fingertip. Thank you, she said to Sheriff Hayes, to Agent Stone, to Mr. Finch. The old clerk huddled in a corner, his eyes moist. Sarah turned back, simply saying, You stood on the right side. In the days that followed, the town changed its tune. People stopped whispering when they saw Elijah. Stores sold ammunition again, sold bolts for the old car. At school, Caleb walked into the yard, and a few children hesitated, then offered a marble. Want to play? Lily was invited to braid hair. Ethan toddled behind Daniel, hugging his teddy bear. Daniel stood in front of the 2 kids who used to throw pebbles, not boasting, just saying, That's enough. Elijah visited the bank, receiving back the previously deducted, unreasonable amount. The bank manager pushed an envelope across. Here's your refund. Elijah nodded, not lingering with a handshake. He hauled lumber back home, and with Sarah, they set new boundary posts on the Brooks land. This post goes deeper, Elijah said. Sarah held the hammer, pounding nails with a steady rhythm. Caleb pulled the string. Lily held the tape measure. Agnes stood at a distance, shading her brow, a faint smile on her lips. That evening, the porch was quiet. Sheriff Hayes stopped by, placing a piece of paper on the table. A schedule for returning confiscated items that weren't evidence. My part's done, he said, his voice lighter. But if there are any other complaints, send them my way. Agent Stone had already left town, leaving behind a dry remark. Keep the ledgers clean. Sarah folded the deed, putting it into a newly sewn leather pouch. I'm going back to rebuild my house. Elijah nodded. Tomorrow, I'll bring some men over, get the frame up. Neither of them spoke of the nights that had passed. They talked about lumber, about well water, about potato rows, ordinary words, like twine wrapped around a wound, holding it together to heal. A few months passed. In the yard, Caleb and Daniel carried planks, passing nails to Elijah. Keep it straight, don't force it, Elijah reminded them. Daniel smiled. Yes, sir, Uncle. Caleb nudged his friend, both of them giggling. Lily spread a blanket under the shade of the birch tree, cutting apple slices, while Ethan ran in circles, his teddy bear slung across his neck like a string of medals. Sarah shoveled sand to fill in cattle tracks, her hair neatly tied back, sleeves rolled up. She looked over. This afternoon, can we go to my well and test the water again? Elijah replied curtly. All right. Sarah decided to stay. The Brooks land, once reclaimed, stood bare but no longer threatened. The well was cleaned out, its bottom filtered. The house had new posts, a new roof. Elijah drove his old car, hauling lumber, letting out a long whine on the slope before slowly crawling up. The car sounds stronger now, Agnes said, setting a basket of pies on the table. Just needs steady oil, Elijah replied, still wiping grease from his hands. Ethan climbed onto a chair, biting into a pie, his words muffled by crumbs. Uncle, will you teach me to drive? When you can reach the pedals, Elijah chuckled. In town, the atmosphere was completely different. Sheriff Hayes walked down the street, people greeting him first. He put up a new notice board, rules for transactions and how to file complaints. Write it down. I'll take it all, he told the blacksmith, then dropped by the general store to remind them to record receipts correctly. This time, the store owner personally wrapped sugar and salt, pushing them towards Elijah. Anything else you need, just say. Elijah pointed. 3-inch nails. Coming right up. People who had once turned their backs now came to the farm. Hands holding seed bags, bundles of rope, a few nails, some panes of glass. They didn't say much. Can I borrow your pump? One asked. I've got good potato seeds, another offered. Elijah accepted, noting it on a piece of paper, with a return date. No one mentioned the old troubles. Agnes shook her head. Folks apologize in their own way. Sarah replied, then we forgive in ours. The children returned to school. Caleb and Daniel rode their bikes side by side. At the gate, the kids who used to throw pebbles offered a hand. Want to play marbles? Lily hesitated as she walked into class. Her teacher placed a hand on her shoulder, pulling up a chair by the window. At recess, Lily shared her sandwich with a new friend, her eyes brighter. That afternoon, Caleb chattered excitedly. Daniel and I won the last game. Elijah nodded, ruffling his son's hair. Good. Keep it fair. On free afternoons, Elijah and Sarah went over to the Brooks land. They measured distances, set posts, pulled string. Sarah pounded nails, sweat trickling down her cheekbones, not complaining. He used to do it like this, she said, her voice steady. Elijah handed her the hammer. Now we do it like this. Both stood in a shared rhythm, not looking back. When the well yielded its first clear stream, Sarah scooped it up, took a small sip, then offered it to Elijah. Clean, she said. Clean, he repeated, as if stamping a simple, sufficient truth. The old car was polished, new glass replaced, the old crack a faint scar. Every morning, the engine started smoothly. Passersby stopped, not to point fingers, but to ask for help pulling a stuck hay wagon, to borrow a cable, to hitch a ride to the market. This one's really tough, the blacksmith praised as he tied a rope. Elijah tightened a bolt. It's tough because you take care of it. Almost a year later, the new house on the Brooks land was finished. The smell of fresh plaster mixed with pine wood. The kitchen had a window overlooking the fields. The dining table was set near the door, with enough room for 6 chairs. Elijah carried the wooden chair Caleb had repaired, placing it beside the table. For who? Lily asked. Sarah looked at Elijah. For someone who'll stop by for dinner every day, she replied, her voice soft. Their affection grew, unspoken. After dinner, Elijah washed dishes. Sarah dried. Sometimes they stood longer by the window, listening to the children laughing and playing outside. Caleb and Daniel whispered secrets, sometimes about a homemade mousetrap, sometimes about winning or losing in class. Lily tucked wildflowers into her mother's hair. Ethan drew a crooked 4-wheeled car, pressing it into Elijah's hand. For you, Uncle. Elijah ruffled the boy's hair. For all of us. A golden afternoon poured over the prairie. The wind carried the scent of ripe wheat and dry grass. The children chased each other, their laughter breaking apart then gathering again. Elijah and Sarah stood at the edge of the field, watching their long shadows on the soft earth. Elijah reached out, his calloused hand taking Sarah's. There was no proposal. He just looked, his eyes direct, peaceful. Sarah smiled, her lips pressed together, the smile reaching the corners of her eyes, giving a tiny nod. Tomorrow, she said, we'll build the kitchen lean-to. Elijah replied. A small plan for tomorrow, enough to say big things. They walked towards the horizon, unhurried. No grand words were needed, only hand holding hand, the steady hum of an engine, children's voices calling to each other, and a piece of land that had learned to stand firm after the storm. There, kindness wasn't loud. Justice didn't need to argue back, and love grew like a tree watered on time, enduring, strong, unpretentious. The new dawn didn't announce itself with thunder and lightning, but with the sound of a door opening each morning. Someone heading to the fields, someone waiting to come home.